I'm Stephen Bernstein, Global Chair of McDermott's Health Industry Practice Group. I'm pleased to present our monthly podcast, Governing Health, geared towards director education. The goal of this series is to supplement the education that directors receive in the boardroom by providing them with concise updates on leading developments and engaging conversations with industry guests that relate to the exercise of their fiduciary duties. On behalf of the Health Industry Practice Group at McDermott, it's a pleasure to have you join us.
Hello again and welcome. I'm your host, Michael Peregrine. We're pleased to have you with us. Today's conversation focuses on the ever-present theme of business combinations, the role and force of M&A activity in healthcare. M&A is something that seems to have been with us forever, a constant and seemingly never-ending cycle of acquisitions, affiliations, and divestitures that has reshaped and is continually reshaping the provider sector, if not the whole healthcare industry. Rare is the healthcare entity that doesn't have to contemplate M&A in some part of its current strategic plan, whether respect to its own goals or those of its competitors. For the factors that prompted M&A deals in the past aren't necessarily the same factors that are prompting today's deals. And the terms and conditions that were customary aren't necessarily those that are driving today's deal making. And that can be a challenge for governing boards as they seek to apply the proper amount of oversight to M&A opportunities and needs. So to help us better understand the latest M&A trends in the industry is my good friend Barry Sagraves, a senior banker with the Chicago-based firm of Juniper Advisory. Barry has been involved in M&A involving healthcare organizations since 1989 and has worked with a number of leading Catholic and nonprofit systems, as well as independent community and public hospitals. Before we turn to Barry, let's pause to revisit an interesting theme from our recent conversation with Ken Kaufman on business disruption. As you may recall, Ken compared the decision-making style of Amazon to those of healthcare providers. He gently but clearly questioned whether the traditional approach to decision-making applied by providers will work going forward when seismic change and business disruption may become ordinary course. Now, to make real change will clearly require a totally out-of-the-box solution. For one, boards will need to step away from the traditional approach to decision-making based on concepts of business judgment, financial stewardship, and reasonableness. And that's a big, big step, not only conceptually, but legally as well. But Ken's challenge is nevertheless intriguing, and you don't need to be Jeff Bezos to understand why. So it might be worthwhile for the board to daydream a bit, maybe at an upcoming retreat, about making its decision-making process more efficient and more responsive, about adding clarity and specificity to risk policies, about encouraging the migration of ideas from within the organization. Of course, any real change would require buy-in from lots of constituencies, and maybe the Attorney General as well. And it might not fly, but as Ken suggests, it surely might make sense to start thinking about it. And now our conversation with my friend Barry Sagraves from Juniper Advisory, who's with me in the studio today. Barry, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be here.
You know, it's an interesting time. Every time we pick up modern healthcare, we're learning about new M&A deals out there, for-profit institutions reselling or divesting hospitals that they bought years before, major new acquisitions, hospital deals, large and small. Maybe we can start off our conversation today by telling our audience with what you see as what's been going on in the industry to date in terms of M&A. What's new for 2017?
Well, one of the really big trends has been that there's been a bifurcation of the market where some of our clients or some people looking for partners are finding many, many suitors, and some others are finding absolutely no suitors. And that's really a new phenomenon. It used to be no matter what, someone would be interested in having you join their system. And today, for a variety of reasons, that's often not the case. So the music is stopping and there aren't any chairs for some of these hospitals looking for partners.
How well is that known? I mean, to an organization that's planning on M&A as an exit strategy or as otherwise part of its strategic plan, how well is it understood that there may not be the right number of suitors or any suitors for their plans?
I don't think it's well known at all. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes that people make, boards and management teams, is waiting too long to think about a partnership. And so we hear all the time people saying, well, we're going to try this, we're going to try this. And if that doesn't work, then we can go find a partner. And the assumption is clearly that there will always be a partner, and that just isn't necessarily the case.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because for my side of the table, the attorney generals and others who will monitor fiduciary conduct will say, before you sell, before you go to the extreme of divestiture, we want to see that you've tried plan A, plan B, and plan C. The typical approach is, okay, do everything you can first before you try the eventual divestiture of assets. And you're saying that may no longer work?
I think that's right. I think that's a risky strategy, and it's an example of people, I think, maintaining the old mindset, which is it's a bad thing to join a system and it means that you've failed. When increasingly in some situations, we're seeing people thinking about how much better they could be and how much better they could serve their community if they did join a system, as opposed to seeing it as an admission of failure.
What's the timing? How much do you need to cut off your timetable and planning process if you need to act now? How does an organization figure out if there's any potential buyer out there and adjust their timetable?
Well, I think people, if left to their own devices, would probably wait a year or more too long. So let's say you have a loss in the first half of your year. People get nervous. The board wants to know more. The management team comes up with a strategy or a plan to try to rectify things. Then they want to give that 6 or 12 months to see whether it works, when in fact it's not necessarily, and usually is not, about the short-term financial situation. It's usually about the longer-term strategic situation.
What do you say to the board member or executive who would say, well, there you go, you're an investment banker, that's what you do, you're just trying to churn deals. We have lots of time, and we know that there are tons of organizations that would be interested in bringing us on board. What's your answer to that?
Well, we think it's really important that people think about these issues and think about partnerships in a very ordered way. And so rather than waiting until they all of a sudden need to pick up the phone and call everyone, they ought to be thinking ahead and saying, let's look at the situation and the issues, and then structure those conversations in a good way. And one of the objections has always been, we don't want to say we're for sale and then not do anything, because then people will think we're damaged goods. So it used to be you did this in secret and then sprang the fact that you'd done a deal. Today, it's much more public that people say, we're always talking to people, we're always talking about partnerships, and it's part of your business rather than a special thing that you don't do very often.
That's kind of a sea change, and it's interesting. What's the profile of those organizations, the organizations that might not find a chair when the music stops?
Well, they would tend to be, they tend to fall into a couple of groups. They tend to be smaller providers. They may be on the fringe of a metropolitan market, or they may be out and be more rural. If they're on the fringe of a metro market, chances are someone in the market would be interested in having them join them. But then occasionally you'll have antitrust concerns and so on. And what we don't see very much of, almost none of at the moment, is organizations entering a new market. So if we had a suburban hospital that was looking for a partner, the chances are that nobody who wasn't currently in that market would want to come to that market and have one hospital, because it's all about networks and contracting and that sort of thing. So that's one example. Smaller hospitals, rural hospitals, really having a hard time. Critical access hospitals, if the reimbursement changes, that's going to be a serious issue. And then for a variety of reasons, there are a lot of public, county, district hospitals that have begun looking for partners, and they have their own sets of challenges.
What else have you seen so far the first 7 months of this year? What are the other trends that are out there?
Well, I mentioned the big increase in public hospitals looking for partners, and that's come about for a variety of reasons. One is the business just keeps getting harder. And so being in the hospital business because of reimbursement, regulation, et cetera, keeps getting more and more complicated and hard to be in. So it's harder for a public entity to compete. Secondly, it's much more important than it used to be in a network of some sort for contracting purposes. And it's difficult to fit a public hospital into some of those networks by the structure and the constraints that they have in terms of the types of things that they can do.
Well, a lot of nonprofit boards would say we have an interest in the public hospital, but two things. Number one, the antitrust concerns. Number two, how long does it take to get a deal done with them? Is it a public referendum? Do we have to go all through RFP processes? What's the process? How easy is it to effect a transaction with a public institution?
Well, it varies a lot depending on where you are. And state law and state constitutions have a big say in the ability to do things. So, for example, in some states, a public hospital is not allowed to be in a joint venture. So that type of relationship is off the table. In Michigan, a couple of years ago, we did a transaction where a not-for-profit wanted to buy a county hospital. But for some reason, the state law said that was not allowed. A for-profit could buy a county hospital, but a nonprofit couldn't. So we had to get legislation passed in order to permit that transaction to go forward. That's a big part of it, is just what are they allowed to do and what are they not allowed to do. Then there are differences in terms of referendums or other approvals. There's how they interact with potentially the Attorney General, but usually the state health department, and a number of other factors, sunshine laws and things like that. It's complicated, but certainly not impossible.
What are the caveats that whether you're advising, let's say, a nonprofit health system that's interested in a public institution, or you're advising the public institution, what are you telling them about length of time process, and expectations about the terms?
Well, I think in terms of length of time, they ought to certainly add some time and probably start with about a quarter, so 3 months maybe, depending on what those approvals are. So it's important to know at the beginning of the process, whether you're the quote seller or the quote buyer, what the approval process is, what the Sunshine Act situations might be, because then you can structure the process to work through those in an appropriate way. So it takes a little longer. It's a little more complicated. The terms aren't necessarily tremendously different, because a public entity that is looking to provide high quality health care for their community, same as a nonprofit organization would be. So what happens after the transaction, the differences may be in the financial terms, depending on what the requirements are for the transaction, or they may also have to do with, in some cases, reporting or oversight. Sometimes the public entity will want to be sure they're continuing to get reports on the performance of the nonprofit partner over time.
Barry, hold that thought. When we come back from a break, I'd like to explore with you more not only the other trends in the first half of 2017, but also specifically what you're seeing in terms of consideration, prices, other terms in these deals, and whether or not people's expectations, whether on the buy or sell side, are realistic in terms of what they're going to get or what they're going to have to give up. Let's pivot for a moment to our regular short segment, What's Trending Now, when we try to flag a new governance issue we see on the horizon. And for me today, that's the emerging focus of how matters of reputation affect the service tenure of directors. A new article published in the Harvard Business Review confirms that the preservation of reputation continues to be a major concern for individual board members. The article suggests that directors are much more likely to resign their board seats when the company and their governance service experiences what they call negative attention. And that's something that governance and compliance committees need to keep in mind when developing effective and responsible director recruitment programs and risk profiles for the organization. Attorneys general understand the leverage of director reputation. They're increasingly willing to use forced resignation and bans on future board service in settlement of allegations of corporate and board misconduct. So individual reputation really counts, and corporate efforts to preserve it will make a lot of sense going forward. And now let's return to our conversation with Barry Sagraves and our discussion about trends in healthcare M&A. Barry, now let's turn to what are some of the deal terms that you're seeing, the kinds of expectations that both buyer and seller should have.
What we're seeing is that not-for-profit systems, particularly larger, healthy ones, have really become the predominant buyers in the market.
Yeah, we use
days.
buyers in a broad
buyers
sense.
loosely, yeah. Partner who someone is going to join their system. We'll talk about that when we talk about the deal terms. The investor-owned companies, of course, are having their own challenges as a sector. So, except in specific and limited situations, they don't tend to be as active on the buy side as they historically have been. And because the nonprofit boards have been reading about the travails of the for-profit sector, they are less interested in selling to a for-profit than they might have been at some point.
That's interesting.
In the past. So the buyers tend to be strategic systems that are strong. The sellers tend to be community hospitals or public hospitals, which are either themselves strong and looking strategically down the road, or are beginning to face some challenges, strategic or financial. And because of this bifurcation, some hospitals are finding that nobody's interested.
Is cash still a factor in consideration, or are there other principal factors that you're seeing?
It primarily is in a deal with a for-profit, but it seems to have become less important than it used to be. Many people will start out with the impression that if we got $100 million, we just argue over how to spend it.
Yeah, we'll just put it in our community foundation or something of that nature.
Yeah. And the people often will actually worry about having a lot of cash around. So it really goes back to who's the partner. And then the actual terms of the transaction are still important, but they tend to not be the point on which the decision is made about who they join. So a nonprofit board, particularly as opposed to a public entity, will say, we think this system can best help us with access and quality and access to capital and that sort of thing. And then you start talking about the terms, and the terms would be what liabilities are assumed, how much capital might be promised to us or committed after the transaction, and then what sorts of commitments on patient care, on employee protections, and so on. And you asked how things are changing. Those sorts of protections and future commitments have really become more important the last few years as Obamacare has been a little bit more in question and the future of it. And so that's become really the heart of the negotiation, even more than some of the other terms.
Barry, in terms of what you're seeing of late, what's your perspective on vertical integration and trends in that nature? How are those levels of activity in the market going?
Well, I think with hospitals, many of them are trying to move both up toward the premium dollar or the insurance end, and move down in terms of some of the additional services, pre and post-acute. And generally speaking, they're doing very well moving down in the patient care areas. So nursing homes, home health, hospice, all those can become part of a productive continuum of care. They have tended to struggle mightily going up towards the insurance part of the market. And there have been a number of high-profile liquidations and closures of health plans that were started by providers in order to help them with their population health strategies. It's interesting because many of the organizations that have been vertically integrated for a long time have found over time that the best way to be successful with a health plan and a provider system is to have them run separately, negotiate at arm's length, and each can be successful, which ends up being good for both of them. The recent strategies for population health have tended to say, we're a hospital company, let's become a payer to support the hospital company, and those sorts of inherent conflicts just don't tend to work out very well.
So is your experience that vertically integrated systems are more attractive or less attractive in the market to a potential partner?
Generally speaking, I think that the buyers tend to be provider-based systems, and they tend to see the fact that you own a health plan as a complication. I'd say even 2 years ago, it would have been a positive because they'd say, oh, great, there's some skill set that we can use to develop population health. But they've been reading about how many of these have not been successful. So they tend to be, at the moment, going back toward the rifle shot. We need hospitals, we need nursing homes, we need physician groups, and the vertical integration, I think, is somewhat less attractive than it used to be.
What's your perspective on the role of population health as a strategy, and whether that's a helpful or hurtful indicia of economic strength of an organization?
Well, I think it's really complicated, and I think the whole concept of population health has always been a bit of a mystery to me, to be honest, because you're talking about an large, complex organization. Even a medium-sized community hospital is a complex organization, completely changing its culture and becoming something it's never been before. And so the idea that a hospital-based population health entity can be successful is, to me, not a certainty. It seems like it's fraught with a lot of risk. And so the organizations that have gone the furthest into population health at this point have either started to be successful, in which case they may be very attractive to partners, or they may not, in which case the partner might say, boy, we've got a lot of unwinding to do here. And that would have an impact not only on what the terms might be, price and other things, but also just whether people are interested or not.
So it's really a matter of where you are on the development scale in terms of your population strategy.
That's right.
What is the level of activity, at least the consideration of intra-market deals, competitors seeking each other out because that's the last resort? Forget about the antitrust perspective for a second, although it's difficult to do so. What are you seeing in that regard? Are people looking at more extreme options in terms of combining the only two hospitals in town, or?
Yeah.
Are they just worried, say, there's just no way we can get this through with the antitrust climate, we're going to have to try something different?
There's a surprising number of organizations still trying to combine the two hospitals in the town. Back in the 90s, certainly, the solution was one of them would sell to somebody else, and sort of the first one that sold won. That hasn't been so much the case lately for a variety of reasons. And we still see a lot of people trying to find ways to get the two hospitals in the one town to merge together. And there are, I think, a lot of entities sort of peddling theories that may promote that sort of activity, which I think usually don't result in a successful combination.
Well, let's pivot for a second. We've looked at 2017 to date, and again, I think one of the most interesting takeaways for our listeners today is that at some point the game of musical chairs may stop, and there won't be enough chairs left on the table for all the participating entities. What do you see coming up in the balance of 2017 and in the future? What should our boards be thinking about?
Well, I think the big thing is to be following the travails of trying to reform Obamacare or doubling down on it or having nothing happen. So it's what happens at the national level is really critical. I think one of the key indicators for people to have their eyes on with that is what happens to the insurance company risk corridors and the funding for that. If the funding remains, then the individual market has a chance to keep functioning, and then the ADA, as it currently is, has a chance of continuing to run. If it doesn't, then I think we'll have more people pulling out of the individual market. The second thing that's critical to be looking at is what happens at the state level in terms of Medicaid funding and waivers. If there's more experimentation either permitted or just taken by the states, then I think that, number one, has a chance to develop some good policy, but number two, it also will create even more winners and losers in terms of interest in different markets.
Well, let's hold on for a second. You know, the level of uncertainty on the future of the ACA is extraordinary, and boards know that. How do you engage, how do you advise a board whether it's on the buy side or the sell side, on M&A strategy when no one knows? I mean, are you telling them to wait? How long can they wait? Tell me in the audience about how you address this question with organizations looking to divest and those looking to acquire.
Well, as a general matter, if there's an organization that ought to be thinking about its independence and thinking about whether it ought to be part of a system, then we think they should go ahead and do that investigation. Otherwise, you're trying to time the market, and that's difficult to do. And what they're doing is they're having conversations with people about the possibility of joining a system. They may decide not to do it, but they'll have been through the process. They'll know what the alternatives are. They'll know who the players are. So it may be that an organization goes through a process of investigation. They decide not to do anything. Things get better from a reimbursement standpoint, and they're fine. Things
get worse.
Or if they get worse, then they'll have a better sense of where they are. But they won't just be sitting there wondering about what their options might be.
So are you basically saying we got to accelerate the process a little bit, be prepared depending on which way things cut?
Yeah, I think so. And being ready and trying to be nimble is really important. And so boards need to be prepared to be decisive when the time comes.
Well, that's a key factor here. I mean, is there some concern, especially on the sell side, that accelerating the process could lead to some kind of institutional uncertainty and turbulence that you're going and you're not going, and the impact on the staff and employees? How does that play out?
It's usually more of a worry than an actual problem. All the time, people are worried about the employees. They're worried about the leading citizens in town. They're worried about the physicians and so on. And what very often happens is you say, we've decided to explore the possibility of a partnership, and people around town say, good, I'm glad you're finally starting to think about those things, because it seems to us you ought to be thinking about it. And so often there's relief when it comes out that you're looking, as opposed to fear and uncertainty.
You mentioned the term partnership, and whether that's a capital P or lower P. Could you talk just real briefly about the extent to which some of these institutions are affiliating through actual partnerships with for-profits, in other words, as opposed to a sole membership transaction? To what extent are these 50-50 or 80-20 partnerships with the for-profits still out there to be had?
They're still out there to be had, and a number of the investor-owned companies that are not experiencing problems at the moment are the ones that are more interested in doing some of these partnerships. So that's an alternative as well. It really comes down to what are the needs and what are the objectives of the organization. And if it can be solved by a cooperative contractual relationship, that's fine. If it needs to be an entire sale, that's fine. Membership substitution, joint operating agreement. There's all these structures, and it's important to know what you need and who you're going to talk to, and then you worry about the structure. We had one quick story. We had a pitch a couple of weeks ago, which we were not successful in which halfway through the discussion, one of the people to whom we were pitching said, look, we want to do structure X with system Y. Can you make that happen? And that was all they were interested in. And we said, yes, we could make that happen, but we don't know whether that would be in your interest to be that single-minded. We may find out, but we'll be reading about it in the paper just like everyone else.
Before we let you go, I think the big question is, when does this stop? Does it ever stop? Or are we just given healthcare as it is right now in the financing model, is M&A just a day-to-day aspect of what we do? Or is there a period in which things will slow down and the activity will stop? What do you see with your crystal ball?
I think the only thing that would make a major difference to the structure of the industry anytime soon would be some sort of massive change in public policy. And whether it's single payer or whether it's a national health service or something like that, that could completely change the situation. Absent that, it's an unbelievably fragmented industry with all kinds of different players, and it needs scale, standardization, and it needs to become more efficient. So what will vary is who's partnering with whom, where the activity is, whether it's frenetic or merely fast, But we don't see any major change absent some huge social change that would lead us to think it's not going to continue very active for a very long time.
So the message to boards from Barry, Sagraves, and Juniper is continue to consider your M&A alternatives, opportunities, risks as part of your strategic plan, because it's just not going to go away.
Absolutely. Yes.
Barry, thanks so very much.
Thank you.
As Barry has just told us, the high level of M&A activity in healthcare is likely to continue for the foreseeable future. But the factors motivating M&A decisions and the framework of transactions is likely to differ. And the universe of potential partners may be shrinking more than just a little bit. So M&A must still be at the forefront of strategic planning for health systems. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode of Governing Health. Be sure to subscribe to the full complimentary podcast series. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and YouTube. There you'll be able to stay up to date with all our future episodes and to re-listen to the old ones. Until next time, I'm your host, Michael Peregrine.
Copyright 2017, Derwent Will Emery. All rights reserved. Any use of these materials, including reproduction, modification, distribution, or republication without the prior written consent of McDermott, Will & Emery is strictly prohibited. This may be considered attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome.